Welcome to the Money to the Masses podcast, putting you in control of your finances. It's a good thing podcasts are free, as this one isn't worth a penny. Here are your hosts, Damien Fay and Andy Leaks.
Now, Damien, before we get on with this week's podcast, you had something quickly to say about our sponsors.
Yeah, we've got a new sponsor, Money Farm, and Money Farm are an online investment advisor and one of the biggest digital wealth management companies in Europe. So a big thank you to them for sponsoring the podcast. Now, Money Farm create portfolios to maximise long-term returns using ETFs to make incredibly cheap portfolios. And you even get the first £10,000 of your portfolio invested without any charge from Money Farm. And if you enter the code MTTM20K into the box when you sign up, you get the first £20,000 of your portfolio invested and run by moneyfarm.com without any charge.
Great stuff. On with this week's show. Hello and welcome to episode 125 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. That beard isn't half coming on well.
Do you know what, Andy? I've not shaved or trimmed for about a week and a half. I've just been so busy.
You don't need to tell me that.
No.
You don't need to tell me that.
I'm going to actually, after this podcast, not just because you pointed it out, but I'm due to go out later tonight, so I don't want to turn up a complete tramp. But yeah, I haven't.
You've got a perfect face for podcasts, is what I would say right now. So, how's your week been, my friend? How's it been?
It was less insulting than the previous 30 seconds, but yeah, it's good. I mean, I'm massively excited, as you know, Andy, because one of the things we're going to talk about today is the One Giant Leap podcast. So it's alive, it's out there, you can go and listen to it, but we're going to talk about it in part today as one of the sections. So yeah, as you know, Andy, it's a labour of love and something that's pretty much been 7 years in the making. And you are an integral part of it, because you've turned it into the piece of magic that it is, because you did all the editing, as you ever do. You skillfully do.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what the response is going to be. I know I'm slightly biased. I know you, and I've been part of the process from the beginning to where it is right now. But I honestly have to say this. I've probably got about 30 podcasts that I subscribe to. I'm a real podcast addict. And it's right up there. It's, even though I've listened to it, edited it, and I know all about it, I've actually listened to it already. It came out today. Today's Friday. The first true proper episode and interview came out today with Oliver and from Cornerstone, and it was brilliant. I listened to the whole thing and genuinely one of my favourite podcasts that's on my actual device.
Yeah, I'm glad you say you didn't say favourite. You said one of, which was quite disappointing. No, I'm only joking. It was brilliant. No, it was brilliant because it's important to me what you think, because obviously you've been part of it and you're one of the only people who did hear the recordings, because you heard the raw recordings and what I was trying to achieve, and so it was important when you fed back what you thought about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a bit about that, and people, I think, Andy, you're going to splice in a bit of the first interview, just a small snippet, just to get people excited about it. And then we'll tell people how they can listen to it, because it's the most important thing they need to do today is to subscribe to the new podcast.
Okay, so we've started on the One Giant Leap podcast, and for those of you who didn't listen to the podcast a couple of weeks ago where we talked about it briefly, what is the One Giant Leap podcast? What's the idea? Why did you do it?
Right, the One Giant Leap podcast is separate to the Money to the Masses podcast. This is always going to be our sort of main show that we do with the money stuff, and don't worry, the money stuff is coming a bit later in this podcast, but the One Giant Leap is the focus just for now. The One Giant Leap podcast was inspired by me trying to encourage and inspire people to follow a passion of theirs, whatever it is, to change their lives, whether it's for more freedom, happiness, wealth. So if you can find a passion, my passion is helping people with money and empowering consumers. So that's where Money to the Masses came from. And people who listen to this podcast know I quit a day job to do this full time. I'd run a blog for 4 years in the background while I had a day job, and that was Money to the Masses in its infancy. And then 4 years into that, I then went full time on the site, and it's now the site that you all know and love, the podcast, the books, and that was 7 years ago. Now, I wanted to inspire people to do that themselves, and the only way you can do that is you could tell them your story about how you went from doing something no one paid any attention to, but took a passion and had a seemingly huge task of trying to reform the financial world, to then turn it into something you love and just do out of a passion, and then does actually become your life and business. So I could tell my story, but that would be tedious and you'd end up sounding a bit self-righteous. So I went out to find a whole bunch of people who had done similar amazing things. So they had a passion for whatever it is, and they had turned it from that, and they pursued it, and it had become, in some cases, businesses or other people. It had become, they changed the lives of other people. So those people I've interviewed, I've done 9 interviews, and so as of Friday the first interview went live. Now if you you can search iTunes. Now before you do anything else today, go to iTunes and search for One Giant Leap, and you will find this show. Now subscribe to it. I want everybody to subscribe to the podcast who is listening to this show, please. Even if you don't listen to the new show, it will help drive it up, and if it gets enough traffic and driven up the chart, then iTunes will hopefully grab hold of it, because they'll think, hold on, a podcast has just arrived that's got thousands of people listening to it immediately. Because obviously we had to build up this podcast, didn't we, Andy, when we started? There was we didn't have an audience already, so we had to build it up. So go and listen to that podcast, subscribe to it. Now, the first episode, I interview somebody called Oliver from Cornerstone. Now, I mean, you use the products of Cornerstone, don't you, Andy?
I do, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, this isn't a plug. This was, me and Andy were talking off air before, when I gave Andy the conversation to edit. He said, I know who they are. Cornerstone are a subscription service for razor blades. And so, rather than you...
Not just razor blades, Damien, male grooming products.
Well, thank you, Andy, for clarifying, because actually I only know them for the razor blades, but they're razor blades. What happened is that Ollie he's in his 20s, he's an incredible guy. He was working in a job that was had a bit of marketing angle. You listen to the podcast, you'll find out more. An incredible story, but the tidbit is that he was in Boots during his lunch hour trying to buy razor blades, queuing, and then he was struck by an idea of there's got to be a better way than doing this. And we all hate this as guys who go into a shop and have to buy razor blades. And that gave birth to a seed of an idea of trying to change the way men bought razor blades. And you've got to go and listen to it, because how he went from that idea, thinking, could we not get this on subscription so I could just have it sent to me every so often when I needed the razor blades, how he turned that, at his age as well, into a business that has had successful crowdfunding and millions of pounds of investment, and is now taking on the likes of Gillette. I mean, it's an incredible story, but what I want people to take away is that it's a story, like all of these interviews, it could be them. There are people, everyone listening to this podcast has a gem of an idea that normally hits them when they're doing something, and they think, wouldn't that be a good idea? The One Giant Leap podcast is all about just following that passion, taking those steps to end up, you don't know where. It's not thinking about the Everest you've got to climb, it's about those steps. And the thing with all of the interviews is that at the end, the people tell their own story during the interview, and they're fun, and you know our personalities, that I will sort of laugh and joke with them and get out some of the real intricacies of what their journey has been. But at the end, I do a quick 2-minute roundup, pulling out the key things to take from each episode, because everybody has a sort of a nuance, that's something that they struck upon that you could take away and help develop your own business or idea. And like I say, the first one is Ollie from Cornerstone, and it's an incredible story. And then each week I'm going to just quickly tell people what the upcoming episodes are, and I won't give away all of them now. I'm going to just give people teasers. If you go to onegiantleappodcast.com, that's a URL that will take you to a page on the current Money to the Masses site that gives you all the details about the podcast and some of the teasers of some of the upcoming episodes, and you can listen and subscribe via that as well. So, I mean, do you want to put in a bit of a teaser now, Andy?
Absolutely, Damien. Here we go. Got it queued up right now.
People listen to this podcast, it could be any time in the future. We're at the beginning of 2017, right at the very beginning of the year. So let's just take it back a bit. When and how did you come up for the idea of your business?
It came about actually in a Boots store, funnily enough. So it was a few years back.
There you go, Boots. You see, I preempted it. I must have guessed.
No, exactly. Well, it came about because I seem to remember I kind of popped out during my lunch break to buy some razors. And it was early in the year. It was cold, raining. I only had a small amount of time for lunch. So having to spend 10 minutes walking to and from Boots wasn't exactly on my priority list. And then when you get into the store, you have to firstly find where the men's department is, and it's on the 9th floor or whatever. And then you go to the bit where the razors are, and there's 50 different products to choose from, and you forget which one you've got at home because there are all these different versions. And then you look at what they cost, and you just think, Christ, this is just crazy.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
It's horrible. And then to top it all off, when you get home and you use the product, most men, you then have an uncomfortable experience. You either cut yourself, you'll get razor burn, you get sensitive skin. And I guess I just sort of, that eureka moment was me in the queue at Boots, just thinking, for Christ's sake, this is just a terrible, terrible experience. Surely it can be done better.
So you were turning that negative experience of Boots, where everybody's pulling their hair out and they're trying to sell you products on those stands around the till. You decided to actually do something and create a business in the queue. So that's incredible. But how? So you had the idea and you thought, what, there's got to be a better way. How did you go about? What was the next step?
Yeah, I mean, it's, from that initial idea to actually launching to the public, it's quite a long journey. So I set up the company sort of legally at Company's House in January 2013. And we launched to the public in July 2014. So it's about 18 months pretty much from that moment to when we went live. I guess those 18 months really were just spent, validating that this annoying thing I'd stumbled across was sufficiently annoying to other people that you could build a business around it. So I spent a lot of time, taking friends and, friends of friends out for coffee and for beers and just asking them about this thing around shaving. And, I guess most of it was around, what are your shopping habits online? What other things do you buy on your mobile or on subscription? And then just specifically on shaving and toiletries, what are your issues and frustrations around shaving? Do you cut yourself? Do you have sensitive skin? Do you get shaving rash, et cetera, et cetera? And just making sure that, I guess, the demand was there and I wasn't just sort of seeing what I wanted to see. And then once I kind of figured out that, okay, no, there is a need for this, the next question is, okay, well, how do you actually, build a business around it? How do you build a brand? How do you do a product?
Okay, so there is the teaser of the One Giant Leap podcast. And do you know what I love about not just that particular episode, and that was Ollie there talking, but all of the episodes? You mentioned and you touched on, Damien, earlier, that it really could be one of our listeners that has had that idea that can go forward and potentially be one of these inspirational people that goes on to make it. The thing is, you sent me over an interview to edit, and when I was editing it, the person who was doing the interview had come up with an idea that I had come up with 5 years prior.
No
genuinely,
way.
I genuinely, I'd come up with that very idea that this person obviously had more get up and go than I did at that particular time, and he went and did it, and power to him. I mean, I was slightly gutted, don't get me wrong, but he went and did it, and it just does go to prove that literally anyone can have these ideas and make something of it.
Yeah.
So
and
exciting stuff.
Two things, actually. I'll give a few quick teasers. There's an episode of an IT consultant who ends up turning a hobby of baking cakes into an industry, a business that's stocked in supermarkets everywhere and sold globally. There is somebody who comes up with an idea that ends up clothing the homeless in London and San Francisco. There's the guy who was 23 stone and lost the weight and ended up on the front cover of Men's Health magazine within 3 years and turned it into a business. There's so many of these stories. There's one guy who ended up being outside Tesco's and only had £6 to his name and couldn't feed his children and turned that around and into a business. And it sounds, you're probably thinking how, but that's the whole point of this podcast, is to inspire people. But anybody who listens to the podcast, before we move on, we've also got a Facebook group. Something we've never done with Money to the Masses. We've toyed with the idea of whether to have some form of Facebook group, like a closed group that people can chat on and discuss things. And I never felt that the money side was, I don't know, I just never, I decided against it for quite a long period of time. And but this now, the One Giant Leap podcast gives us a good excuse to now go into that, because what we want to do is try and talk to people, encourage them, share ideas of everybody who listens to the podcast and other people. And it won't be people just in the UK, there'll be people globally, hopefully, because that's the podcast is a universal theme. So we want to try and go in there. People can talk to me and other people. You're in there, Andy, so people can chat to us about what they're doing. They can chat to each other. We're going to put things in there that can help them along the journey. So do go, if you go to that onegiantleappodcast.com URL, you'll see a link to how you can join that Facebook group as well.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping to liaise and speak to some of you listeners. It'll be good, because Damien always gets all the feedback and the questions and stuff, and that's great because that's his expertise. But if you have any podcast questions or anything podcast related, editing related, I'll be happy to help you out. It'll be good fun.
Yeah, I tell you what, if you ever do a podcast, or you want to do a podcast, I'm probably speaking a little bit out of turn here for Andy, but you should get Andy on board, because Andy, I wouldn't be able to have done the podcast without Andy doing the editing. And I've done a number of podcasts for other people, and the professional ones as well, and the editing has never been as good as Andy's. So it may be something, if you ever get inspired at your idea, that you decide to take that one giant leap, and the name is obviously from the idea that you're on the edge of a cliff and got to take a leap of faith to follow your dream. If it's podcasting, then you need to speak to Andy.
Good. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that plug, Damien. Right. Okay. Money now. What have we got coming up on the podcast that's money related?
Right. I've got a couple of pieces that I want to do on money related. Now, the first one is slightly topical, but there's an evergreen angle to this. Now, this week there were two papers that were produced surrounding the state pension. And I don't know if you noticed it, Andy, you probably had far more going on in your life than to look for white papers that were released about the state pension age.
I have to say, they just slipped underneath my sort of eye level. I think
They didn't register on your radar, unfortunately. No, that's just as well. You're on this podcast. What they were, there were two papers that were looking at proposals and ideas around the state pension, and in particular the state pension age. Now, anybody who, if you don't know, the state pension age has been it's 65. It's been moving to 65 for women as well, because it used to be it wasn't equal in the past. Men and women had different state pension ages, and by the time we get to 2018, it will be 65 for everyone, and then it's going to move on to 66, 67, and 68. It will depend on when you're born. Now, what these papers that were produced, and they were produced that the government are going to look at and consult on, and then perhaps make some decisions in May this year, so you've got to look at it in a few months. This is what I'm talking about. It's a bit of an FYI, is that they're looking to delay the state pension age even further. So the key takeaways: if you're under 45, you're likely to have to work a year longer to get your state pension, which is to age 68. And if you're under 30 and you're listening to this podcast, then you're looking like you're going to have to be 70 years old before you get your state pension. So the reason I mention it is not, these are proposals, so they're not actually happening, but they show the intention and the need for the state pension to always be looked at and changed. Because I don't know if people realise that the way that your national insurance contributions work, when you don't pay into a pot that's yours when you're working, which you then draw upon when you get your state pension. What actually happens is this: imagine just like a big bank account, and all the money goes in, and the pensioners who are in existence now, so your nan or something, goes and draws out that money the same day. There is no...
Hang on a minute. So I'm giving money to my nan?
You are effectively, you're supporting your nan directly.
I mean, I don't begrudge her that. She's a wonderful nan.
So when she gives you that £1 coin in your birthday card, Andy, it's just a circular bit of money that's coming back to you. But the point is that there isn't a pot of money for you. So there are going to be more and more people reaching the state pension age, and basically more old people, and fewer of us to pay the tax and national insurance to support them. So what's going to happen is they're going to have to, in the end, either reduce the state pension, or they're going to have to make it harder for people to get it by making it go on. You have to be older before you get in. Hopefully, therefore, a bunch of people never make it and they don't draw on it. It sounds harsh, but that's what they're doing. And but the reality is that if you're planning for retirement, so if you're sitting there now and you're thinking about your retirement, especially if you're young, and my tip is, when you're doing that, don't ever bake in the fact you'll get a state pension into those figures. Now, the state pension, the new flat rate pension is about £155 a week, so it works out to be just over £8,000 a year. I would treat that as a Brucey bonus when I do financial planning. If I sit down with somebody, it's like we want to get to a certain figure, or we're working out what their retirement will look like. I exclude the state pension, and then at the end it's like, ta-da, here's a bit of extra money that might be a bit of a sweetener, because there's no guarantee you're going to get any of that money, because it just, for me, it just shows if we're already talking about tinkering these things, and it's always about pushing the state pension age further back or changing the way that they're inflated each year, then that shows the direction of travel that it's going to be to probably remove and reduce the amount of this. So tip is, don't rely on a state pension, because you're probably not going to get one if you're young and like under 40, or it's very unlikely, because let's be honest, that's 35 years time. In the last few years, the changes to pensions has been incredible. The chances of there being even more monumental changes in 35 years is an absolute certainty. So there's my quick tip. And one thing to also mention before we move on, in the past, I don't know if people have seen, there's a group called WASPI, W-A-S-P-I, which is a group of women who were understandably angry about the fact that their state pension age was staggered and moved up. So when they equalised pension ages, what they did is, rather than just say, right, okay, all these people who were born before this date, your pension age is still 60, all the people after this day, born after this day, yours is now 65. That was seen as too harsh. So they staggered it. So depending on what period you were born, over a few years, I think it's about a 5-year period, some people would have a 60 state pension age, some would have 60 years and 1 month, then it's 60 years, 2 months, if that makes sense, staggered all the way up to there's a point where people actually now have a retirement age of 65. The thing is that when those rules were made and there were changes to state pension ages and stuff like that in the past, they weren't communicated by the government to people. They were just announced that's what's happening. But these women are pretty angry about the fact that no one wrote to them personally and said, your pension age is changing now, which doesn't really matter whether you agree with them or not. The point is, you can't rely on the government to tell you of these changes, so you have to be keeping an eye out. So keep an eye out for later this year for any changes, and also always go and check on the .gov.uk website. So go to .gov.uk/state-pension-age. So .gov.uk/state-pension-age, and you can check your state pension age there and then by inputting your date of birth.
Brilliant. Okay, pension's done. What else have we got?
Pension's done, Andy. We're going to have two money. One's money saving, and one is just an interesting admin exercise that might actually make people with budgeting a bit easier. I'll start with that one. And I don't know about you, but if your council tax is paid by 10 equal instalments, so even though your council tax is worked out for a year, you pay 10 months in a row. If you do it on a monthly basis, you do 10 months in a row by direct debit, and then you have 2 months off at the end.
Yep, you can choose to do it that way.
Yeah.
I currently don't, but...
Well, how do you do it? How do you pay yours?
I used to do it in 10 months and have the 2 clear months.
Yeah.
But I changed the way I budgeted slightly, and so contacted them and then asked to do it over 12 months.
Andy,
that might screw up your point.
Whoa, Andy, stop. You've not screwed up my point. That is my point. This is exactly my point. Because they've always done it with 10 months, and I pay mine, I have 10 months and then I have 2 months off. But people don't realise that you can ask to change it to have that amount split over 12 months. So actually, cost you...
I'm ahead of the curve. I did something that you're about to recommend.
Andy, you are way ahead of the curve. So far ahead of the curve. I mean, I didn't even know you could do this, and I don't know everything at all. So that just proves the point. But there was I saw a lot about it recently with people talking, but you have to act very quickly, which is why I mention it, because obviously you've just got your bills for next year, or you will be getting them for next year in terms of your council tax, because it runs from April to April.
Gone up another 3%. Thank you very much, Kent Council.
Yeah, I feel your pain, Andy. But they have cut-offs for where they will actually make the adjustments and change the way you pay it. But if you contact your council quickly, they should change it, and they can change it so you have it over 12 months rather than 10, which means you just pay a little bit less a month. But you might like having 10 and then 2 months off as a Brucey bonus if you keep it the way it currently is. Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insights, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show. Right, the last piece I want to jump onto is something called skimming. And it's an unfortunate term. I don't know why they coined that term, but in the past you and I have talked about save the change, and you do it and I do it. Is that right, Andy?
Yes, yeah. So my bank automatically rounds up purchases to the nearest pound, and that gets put into a savings account. It's quite good fun.
Yeah. So the save the change idea, Lloyds do it. Lloyds are about the only bank that I know that do this. So as Andy said, you go and buy your cup of coffee for £2.70. When you use your card and pay for it, the bank will obviously pay the coffee shop £2.70, but they'll automatically round it up and move the 30p difference into your savings account. So the idea is every time you're using your card, you're actually saving. And it's a brilliant way of being able to start saving, even if you think you can't, because you don't notice the difference. Now, this got me thinking, because unfortunately, if you don't want to bank with Lloyds, which many people won't want to, then are there other things you can do to do this very same idea? And there are two things you can do which are quite interesting. One of them is to do it yourself. Now, the idea of skimming, this is where it comes from. There is a term, it's been around for a while. I've seen it mentioned in one or two places, and there are people who, what they do is, rather than relying on the bank to do the rounding up, as you say, they do something slightly differently. So let's say you log into your online banking and you see that you've got, I don't know, £127 in your bank account. And obviously maybe there's pence, £127 and however many pence. If your budgeting is going well at that point in time, the idea of skimming is you would then take that, say, £7.58, to round it down to the nearest £10 to 120, you would take that and you'd move that into a savings account. If you weren't feeling that flush and your budgeting wasn't going as well, you might round it down to the nearest £5. So in that example, you might take £2.58 out, so you just round that down to £125. So you're doing a manual skim, but there are people who've done this over long periods of time, and they are larger sums than obviously we were talking about with the save the change idea, which is something that Lloyds do automatically. You just sign up for, which is done on just pence. This is done on, you can do yourself on almost up to £10. And how often people do this is dependent on, obviously, their own budgeting. It may be every time they log into their internet banking. It may be once a week. It may be less frequent. But it's quite a nice idea to enable you to start actively saving money, but doing it while budgeting at the same time. So you've got an eye on how well you're doing, and then as a almost reward, you then move a little bit into saving. So doing so, you are not reliant on having to use your card or anything like that. It's just more about you keeping an eye on your budgeting, so which I quite like.
So would it be an idea of that where someone would literally just move it over, or is there an app for it? Is it just a kind of like a good habit to get into? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I mean, Andy, you seem to be so far ahead of the curve today. I don't know what you had for breakfast, but there is, what I'm describing is a manual process which you would do yourself, but there is an app for that. There is an app that does pretty much the same thing for you, but saves automatically, and it's called Get Chip. I've not used it, but I've seen reviews of it, and I've spoken to one or two people who have actually used it. It seems like a neat idea. I'd love people who listen to this podcast, if they try it, then let me know what they think. And like the guy who did when we talked about energy switching the other week, who tried it and then encouraged you to do it, Andy. But yeah, I'd love to hear, because I've obviously used the Save the Change idea, but I'd also like to hear what this Get Chip app is like. But yeah, it does exactly the same thing. So yeah, you're way ahead of the curve, Andy. You can do it manually, or there are now even things that will do it for you.
Good. So new podcasts, pension changes, council tax, skimming. We've covered the lot, Damien.
We've done well, Andy, didn't we? We did well. So as usual, anybody who's listened to the podcast, please leave us a review on this podcast. Particularly give us a review on the new podcast. Even if you don't listen to it, just tell us it's amazing to get it up that chart. Yeah, and you can contact me. I'm getting more and more questions via Twitter. Usual handle, money to the masses with the number 2. And you can get us on email, podcast at moneytothemasses, or Damien at moneytothemasses.com. And again, go and check out the onegiantleappodcast.com URL and you can find out more about the new podcast.
Good, until next week.
Until next week.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.